Hello friends, it's Kayla and it's finally time to talk about my favorite books of 2021. I'm going to give you a top 10. I've spent the last week rereading a lot of my 4.5 and 5-star reads of the year, trying to decide if they should be in this top 10. Some have left the top 10, some surprising ones have come in. It's been a lot of fun and it's my new end of year annual tradition. I read 181 books total this year. So let's talk about my 10 favorites. I'm gonna decide the order as I go through this video, but the book that most recently, just last night, entered the top 10, solidified its place here, I'm gonna put in the 10th position, and that is Tinfoil Butterfly by Rachel Eve Moulton. When I read this originally, I did say in that vlog, I'm considering this being one of my favorite books of the year. But at that point, we were only a third of the way into the year, so I didn't really have that many books on that list to begin with. And I'm kind of surprised, I think other people might be surprised that this made it in, just because I haven't had that many opportunities or taken that many to talk about this throughout the year. And it's also not as recent of a read as many other horror, I'm classifying this as horror, but we'll talk about it in a second, as many other horror books that I've read this year. It's funny when I ask people, what do you think is going to be in my top 10? A lot of times people will just guess the ones that I most recently read and loved, because they're obviously the most recent in memory, but these were really spread out through the entire year. So this is what I would call a harrowing, contemporary, slow horror story. It's about this woman named Emma who, through a bunch of difficult life circumstances, ends up abandoned on the side of the road and finds a child. A little boy named Earl has a strange encounter with him and his tinfoil mask, and they end up on a journey of survival together, and Emma feels like she needs to protect this child and figure out what's going on in his strange world. She has a lot of things to work through, and the book has a lot of flashbacks. I love a book that is about a current intense scenario, but we have a lot of references to the past. It's like when you think a book is just saying one thing, but it is subtly saying a lot of other things. It's ultimately a story about evil, the realities of humanity, and facing your fears in more ways than one. In 8th and 9th position are also books that I talked about at the beginning of the year that I thought could be favorites, but they were 4.5s. But upon rereading them, or sections of them this week, they continue to be standout reads for me, and they have a mix of reality and fantasy. So in number 9, I'm going to put the only YA on this list, The Wild Ones by Nafisa Assad. This is not like any fantasy book I've ever really read, because it's so much about a group of girls and their friendship and their coming together to survive difficult things. This is a difficult book to read. It doesn't hold back with the depictions of abuse and abandonment and betrayal that these girls experience. This stands out for me because of the writing style especially. There's 3 main things going on in here. We have a collective voice who's narrating what these girls are up to. They're just traveling together, experiencing different cultures and countries, and healing. It's ultimately about magic and healing and sisterhood. And then another perspective is our main character, Paheli, who is responsible for bringing all these girls together. And then the third section is inserted stories of each individual wild one, and the past that they come from and everything that they're healing from. I say it's not like any other fantasy I've read because I feel like it's not especially descriptive in its world building and magic system. There's this idea of the between and traveling outside of reality, and a lot of the book takes place in this weird between, and it's an adventure story where the girls have to come together to decide to save this boy, protect him, and work together. It's just like a really beautiful overall narrative, more so than plot. I feel like the conversations and friendship and topics that are covered are why this left such an impact on me. Next up in the number 8 position is Mrs. Death by Selena Godin. This is another one of the most unique books that I've read, especially in like perspective and writing style. We're following two main characters, Death, who is personified, and Wolf, who is being tasked to write Death's story, memoir. We do get to learn about Wolf, and the first time I read this through, Wolf's perspective being the more straightforward linear narrative was the one that I enjoyed less, and the lyrical poetic style of Death, her narration and her like going through different infamous deaths and massacres that have happened across time, and her perspective and thoughts on just like how to live your life and what death is and what time means. That's what was so powerful to me. But upon reread, Wolf became just as equal a powerful narrator. A lot of it is kind of told to the reader, and it has just a really unique impact. I feel like it's kind of a quirky narration. I highly recommend the audiobook. And there's just this overall concept that I feel like a lot of people can connect to, the death, just living her everyday life, like going to see a therapist, just like being a person. Sometimes all she sees is death, and it's hard to go on living when all you see is the shitty parts of life. It's not the most hope-filled narrative, but I feel like it does have a lot of different tones throughout it and themes, and the concepts were just so fascinating that this is in my top 10. In the number 7 spot is one of 2 nonfictions on this list. This one is 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act, Helping Canadians Make Reconciliation with Indigenous Peoples a Reality by Bob Joseph. I read this in the first month of the year. It has remained one of my favorite nonfictions and one of my most recommended nonfictions, Canadian or otherwise. This dives into the Indian Act, a government-made piece that has controlled Indigenous peoples since 1876. It's a fantastic resource that goes through, breaks down what the Indian Act is, how it's changed over time, the malicious intent by the government to make you think certain amendments of the act mean more than they do, what truth and reconciliation really means, what Canadians can do to encourage a better relationship. There are fantastic calls to action in the back and a ton of resources within this. It's a pretty invaluable book that I think any Canadian could benefit from being confronted with the like violent eradication of a culture that has been going on and continues to go on to this day, and things that you may have not learned in school, and also just a resource for people outside of Canada to make realizations about a country that oftentimes is romanticized, both externally and internally. So that holds a pretty important part in this list. Switching gears, my number 6 spot is going to be my second of 4 horror in this list, and I think this one might be a bit of a surprise. I read this during a month of reading like 20 horror books, and it might have not seemed like it made as big of an impact as it did because I haven't like talked about it much more since then. But This Thing Between Us by Gus Marino, especially this week upon rereading certain segments, like this is one of my favorite horrors I have read. It's in my like top 20 horror books of all time. Again, I think the writing style itself could be responsible for my enjoyment. It's written like to a person. It's lengthy. It doesn't have a lot of breaks. It's a lot of internal monologue, which is something that I really enjoy. So we're following a guy named Diego, and his wife recently passed. Her death has gotten a lot of publicity, a lot of it negatively or exploited, used by various figureheads, politicians, to further their own agenda with regards to like immigration policies. There's a lot to unpack about her death and what really happened, so I don't want to give it all away. But because of all this attention and, you know, conversations constantly coming at him from friends and family about his wife and the life that she lived, he feels like nobody understands her and therefore nobody understands him, and he goes to live in this remote cottage. I love horror that has a lot more to say and has a lot more themes other than just like, here's a scary thing. So the scary thing is very minimal, but it's just perfectly balanced for me. You can't really put this in a box of what the horror is. I feel like it fits into a lot of different subgenres, but generally it is more of a conceptual horror. We've got ideas of like scary tech, ghosts and spirits and zombie type conversations, and there are things going on that he feels like some evil entity has followed him to what is supposed to be his safe space. Clearly from my list and from all the things you know me to love, conversations about death and grief are some of my favorite things, and the idea of something feeding on his grief is amazing. I love how this book is written. I love the introduction of kind of a folklore vibe. There's a lot of culture inserted in here, and I thought it was extremely well done. We've now cracked the top 5, and in this position is my one thriller of the year that made it onto the list. Thrillers often don't, though I read them a lot and enjoy them. A 5-star thriller is few and far between. So, In My Dreams I Hold the Knife by Ashley Winstead is my favorite of the year. It's in my, like, again, I say like safely, it's in my top 20 favorite thrillers of all time, just because like I don't know what that list is, but that feels right. And really it's just because it was fun and it gave me everything that I'm looking for in a thriller. It was surprising, it was over the top, and just generally fun and fast paced. It has a setup I really enjoy. 6 friends, 1 college reunion, 1 unsolved murder. We're mainly following a main character who is determined to show up to this reunion being like perfect and having everybody see her as having it all together. And obviously everybody at this reunion, as we will come to find, has different motivations for what they want out of the weekend, including one person who is determined to find out who murdered a girl in their friend group, Heather, back when they were in college. So they organize different ways to like get them all in the same place and kind of interrogate them. And it's just a fun read because you get to see how these characters all originally met, the things they had in common, the secrets they were hiding from each other, the relationships they had no one else was allowed to know about. As I've said a few times recently, this isn't the most groundbreaking thriller I've ever read. I don't think it has the most like calculating characters or the most masterfully done plot twists. I love the setting, I loved all the characters, finding out their motivations. I think it has a good payoff, and that's why it's in my top 5. In my number 4 spot is the book that none of us saw coming, and that's Dune by Frank Herbert. My top 11, if I were to include it, would be Dune and also Dune Messiah. I feel like this story overall is one of my favorite SFF like experiences. Let me just hold up this while I tell you about it. The plot of Dune, we're mainly following a guy named Paul, and through his like childhood and adulthood he becomes more responsible for certain things, and we're following his journey, but also a lot of other characters. We're in everybody's head all at the same time, hearing what everybody's thinking all at the same time. Again, I love internal monologue. I love just getting to hear what people are thinking constantly, even if it's repetitive. And considering how this was originally published, it makes a lot of sense why there's a lot of repetition. But basically there's this planet, there's a substance called the spice, and it's about like politics and control and like what different people are going to do if they have the power, the control over this planet, what the people on that planet are going through, various relationships, betrayals, fighting that goes on, the battles, the religious influence. Like there's a lot of conversations that Frank Herbert clearly wanted to have with this series, and I loved it all. I truly loved every single page of this, every journey that we went down. It had a lot less like survival and action than I knew it to have, and just a lot of learning about different people and their motivations and how they felt about certain things. And it wasn't so much about what was going on, but like why people were doing what they were doing and why people thought certain things, how corruption happens. And it's just a really fascinating little book. I think the way that it's written, again, is something that makes it my favorite. There's little excerpts from historically relevant texts that give you a clue of what's to come in the chapter and give you just this bigger worldview that's so fun. I feel like I could both gush about this, but also like just not give eloquent thoughts on it for hours, because many of these books are too smart for me to sum up in a successful way. Next up, in the number 3 spot, is the other nonfiction. It's called Biased: Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice That Shapes What We See, Think, and Do by Jennifer L. Eberhardt, PhD. This is one of the best nonfiction books I've ever read. Has the best balance of a nonfiction that I've read. It introduced concepts in such a fantastic way that you can tell it's coming from an expert, but I think what's so evident is how much of an expert she is at making grander concepts that she's clearly spent years and years figuring out in an understandable way to just a regular person. I think it takes a lot of skill to do that, and there were many times that I was just like learning great things, and then an equal amount of times that I was like, wow, this is so impressive that she just made me understand that thing. This is another one of the 10 I would highly recommend the audiobook for, especially the first quarter of this. There are so many numbers and statistics thrown at you, especially regarding racial bias, that it can not feel like it has the same impact, I feel, just reading numbers, as listening to somebody really talk it through with you. She takes experiences of her own from her real life, her life as a parent, her life as a professional, her life as an educator, and provides you with fascinating studies, personal anecdotes, stories from other people she has encountered, and just like the evidence of how bias affects every single thing that we encounter. A huge portion of this is about bias within police and she being involved with police training. She shares a lot of facts and things that are evident and like you can clearly already see proof of in everyday life, but then gives the vocabulary for what you're really, or like what's really going on. There's this whole segment about moral credentialing that I found fascinating, and also talks about bias within corporations and bias training, which is something that has been really prevalent over the last few years, with like different encounters with employees and customers, and why it's one of my favorite things to recommend. Now into the top 2. They are both horror books, and if you've been around for any period of time, you already know what they are, but I'll talk about them again. In the number 2 spot is My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones. Talking about internal monologue, I'm glad we already had a couple conversations about how much I love it, because that is definitely the case here and why a lot of people seem to not love this. We're following Jade. This is a horror book, but it's not like your standard horror book. I feel like that a lot of people I even have been used to in my reading life. It's very slow. It's a lot of just her going around and just thinking about things, and then it ramps up a lot at the end to become a true slasher horror. So Jade is obsessed with the slasher genre. She loves movies, she writes essays, and she's trying to convince everyone around her that she believes a slasher movie is coming to life around them. She's casting everybody in her mind as different like typical tropes in a horror movie. And one of the biggest payoffs of this is that like half of the tropes are spelled out to you, and it's Jade recognizing like, hey, this girl that I just met is a stereotypical final girl. Here's everything she has to do to fulfill her destiny in this narrative. But then half of it is just subtle, like nuanced things that you as the reader recognize as horror tropes. Jade herself is such a fascinating character to me. I love being in her mind. And she is that typical character who nobody believes, who thinks that something is going on, and because of her life and her family and her history, which are also things that she has to grapple with. This is a dark book in a lot of ways. She has to confront her own demons, as well as just like the supernatural ones that come into the picture. But because of all those things, people don't want to take her seriously. And she ends up in a lot of like weird conversations and scenarios because she's not coming across to people the way that she needs to accomplish all of her goals. There's also themes of like gentrification. As Stephen Graham Jones is an Indigenous author, there are different conversations that come in, as he does with many of his books, about land and community and oppressive systems. And it was so fun, and I wish that everybody loved this. And lastly, as the sun is going down and I'm losing my light, my favorite book of the year, and the one that I'm going to fail in explaining the most, is House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. I made a lot of you read this with me for the Literally Dead Book Club, and you're welcome or I'm sorry. I just think that this is such an achievement. I can't get over it. And I've become one of those people that when people don't love it, or I don't know, I just go like, but just understand it, because it's doing so many cool things. And like, part of the thing about House of Leaves is it's exhausting. It's intentionally exhausting and frustrating, and you have to be okay with that and recognize that as not like an enjoyable part of the reading experience, but an important part of the reading experience. I heard someone say that you will get as much out of this book as you put into it. So you have to be patient. And if you've never looked at House of Leaves, there's a story within a story within a story. There's footnotes upon footnotes. There's things you have to read in a mirror and upside down. And yes, it's annoying, but it's annoying for all of us because it's a labyrinth. This house that has been imagined is a labyrinth, and it's bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. And you know, in a puzzle, in a maze, you're going to reach frustrating moments. You're going to go down a corridor that leads nowhere. You're going to reach a dead end. You're going to be confused. You're going to be mad. And that's what this book causes. And I just think it's so smart how the writing reflects the experience and how the experience is seen in the plot. So the plot, we have this guy named Johnny, and he basically, per different situations, finds a series of documents talking about a movie. So you're reading Johnny's thoughts and just like his life experiences after he encounters this collection of documents, and then you're also reading the collection of documents, and then you're also experiencing the film that is being referenced, which follows a man and his family moving into a house and them discovering there are weird things about the house. And then they bring in a whole bunch of other people, and everybody tries to figure out what's going on in the house. It is truly a descent into madness. It is a super wild reading experience. There are parts that you want to skim. There are parts that you flip through so quickly. There are parts that you're flipping the book around, going back here, going back here, going back here. And you have to be patient with the book and do everything that the book wants you to do to get the full experience. And I know that even if you do everything and you are patient, this isn't the book for everyone. And I don't actually think that like everyone can love the book if they just read it the right way. While I do think it's a little underappreciated, it is a super well-known best-selling book, so it's not. It's perfectly appreciated. I just can't believe it took me so long to pick it up. I thought it was gonna be like too smart for me. And I mean, it is. It is too smart for me. There are so many things that you can learn upon every single reread. And that's the fun of it, because it is like a puzzle. There are certain references you won't understand until you read it again. I have read chunks of this more than once, but I've only read it full out once. So upon my official full reread, that's when I will decide if this is my favorite book of all time. Right now I'm not claiming it, but it's no doubt in the top 5. And that's it. At the end of a pretty messy reading year, filled with a lot of things I didn't love, those are the 10 that stood out the most to me. I would love to know if you've picked any of these up yourself or you're planning to now. If you want to share with me your top 10, or you talk about it elsewhere on the internet and you want to link me to it, I love checking out everybody's lists, especially if it's on Instagram, and especially if you think we have some things in common, because I will be looking at so many people's favorites lists of the year for reasons. So tomorrow's video will be everything that I read in the year, all of my stats, all the 181 books. So I will see you then. Bye.